The night was especially cold, and the fog seemed like a heavy blanket covering the small cemetery on the outskirts of town. Lucas and his two friends, Anna and Gabriel, had decided to visit the place after hearing scary stories in a conversation circle. They knew it was a reckless idea, but their fascination with the unknown overcame their common sense. The iron gate creaked in protest as Lucas pushed it open. Inside, the silence seemed alive, broken only by the sound of dry leaves under their feet. The tombstones, some tilted with the passing of time, stood like stone sentinels in the darkness. The flashlight in Anna's hand trembled, casting shadows that seemed to move independently. "Do you feel that?" Gabriel asked, his voice low, almost like a whisper. It was hard to explain, but the air there seemed denser, as if something invisible was watching. Anna tried to laugh, but the tension on her face was evident. As they walked among the graves, the group remained silent, each fighting against growing fear. It was then that Lucas stopped abruptly. "Over there," he said, pointing to a spot between the nearby trees. A hazy figure seemed to emerge from the fog, tall and motionless. Anna and Gabriel stood still, trying to decipher what they were seeing. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, the light illuminated the figure's face. It was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that seemed to penetrate straight into their souls. This can't be real," Anna stammered, holding Lucas's arm tightly. Gabriel, unable to look away, took an involuntary step back, stepping on a twig that cracked loudly in the silence. At the same moment, the figure disappeared into the fog, as if it had never been there. The group stood still for long seconds, unable to decide what to do. Finally, Lucas murmured, "Let's go. Now." They turned quickly, hurrying back to the gate. But the way back seemed longer, as if the cemetery had turned into an endless maze. On the way, the feeling of being watched remained. Anna, looking back, saw a quick movement in the fog, like a shadow that disappeared before she could focus on it. They reached the gate panting, and Lucas closed it with a bang. Back in the safety of their homes, the group could never forget that night. Lucas began to have recurring nightmares, always with the same figure watching him from a distance. Anna developed an inexplicable fear of fog, and Gabriel avoided any conversation about cemeteries. They never returned to the place, but the weight of that encounter remained with them, a dark reminder of what might lurk in the darkness. Rosa's job as a cemetery caretaker was a lonely but peaceful one. She enjoyed the routine of tending to the graves, sweeping up dead leaves, and making sure everything was in order. During the day, the place seemed peaceful, almost welcoming, with the birds singing and the sunlight filtering through the ancient trees. At night, however, the scene changed completely. It was early autumn when Rosa had her first inexplicable experience. The sun had already set, and the sky was tinged with orange and purple as she finished mowing the grass in one of the far corners of the cemetery. It was completely silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves. She was gathering up her tools when she heard the sound of light footsteps behind her. Turning quickly, Rosa saw no one. "I must be imagining it," she muttered, trying to ignore the feeling that she was being watched. But as she walked back to the shed to put away her tools, the sound returned, this time more clearly. Footsteps and then whispers. "Is anyone there?" she called, her voice echoing among the graves. No answer. Rosa quickened her pace, her heart pounding. When she reached the storage room, she locked the door and tried to convince herself that it was all just her tired mind. In the days that followed, the whispers continued, always at dusk. At first, Rosa tried to ignore them, but they seemed to grow more persistent, more clear. It was as if voices were coming from among the graves, calling her name. "Rosa! Rosa!" The sound was faint but distinct, carried by the wind. One night, overcome by curiosity and fear, she decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, she walked to the place where the voices seemed to be loudest. It was an old section of the cemetery, with graves so old that the inscriptions were barely legible. When she reached the center of the area, the whispers abruptly stopped, leaving an almost deafening silence. Then, suddenly, she heard the sound of crying. It was a low, pained wail that seemed to come from all directions. Rosa froze, unable to determine the direction of the sound. She swung her flashlight around, illuminating the tombstones and nearby trees, but there was no one there. The crying turned into a low, hoarse laugh that made her skin crawl. Without thinking twice, Rosa ran back to the shed, locking herself inside until dawn. When daylight came, the cemetery seemed normal again, as if nothing had happened. Despite her fear, Rosa continued working. But the experiences began to weigh on her mind. The voices became more frequent, and sometimes she thought she saw shadows moving in the corners of her eyes. The situation culminated one night when, while sweeping near the cemetery chapel, Rosa clearly heard a male voice say, "Go away." Frightened, she dropped the broom and ran home. Rosa never told anyone about what she had experienced, but from that day on, she refused to work after sunset. To her, the whispers and voices were a reminder that the cemetery was not just a place for the dead to rest, but also for dark secrets that might never be revealed. Carlos was a security guard at one of the city's largest cemeteries. Working at night gave him a sense of isolation, but he enjoyed the tranquility. However, everything changed when he began to notice something strange during his rounds. The first encounter happened on a particularly cold night. Carlos was checking the main gate when he saw a figure in the distance, among the graves. It was a woman with long hair, wearing a white dress that seemed to shine in the moonlight. She stood still, with her back to him, as if she were observing a tomb. "Hey, ma'am, the cemetery is closed," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. There was no response. He took a few steps forward, trying not to scare her, but the figure didn't move. As he got closer, something strange happened. The woman disappeared before his eyes, as if she had dissolved in the breeze. Carlos froze, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. He walked to the place where the woman was, but there was no sign of her. Only the damp grass beneath his feet and the eerie silence of the cemetery. For the next few days, the image of the woman in white would not leave his mind. He tried to rationalize what had happened, telling himself that it could have been an illusion caused by the light or fatigue. But then, a week later, he saw her again. It was a moonless night, and the cemetery was shrouded in complete darkness except for the dim light of his flashlight. As he made his usual rounds, he spotted the same figure in white, this time closer to the chapel. She was standing still, looking directly at him. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Madam, you can't be here," he said, slowly approaching. The woman didn't answer, but something about her posture seemed different this time. It was as if she had been waiting for him. When he was a few feet away, the woman began to move, walking slowly in the opposite direction. Carlos followed her, determined to find out who she was. But as she walked away, he realized that her feet were not touching the ground. Panic began to take hold of him, but before he could react, the figure disappeared once more, leaving behind an eerie silence. That night, Carlos reported the incident to his supervisor, but received only laughter in response. "You're seeing things, man. It's just your mind playing tricks." But Carlos knew that what he had seen was real. Over the next few weeks, he continued to see the woman in white in different parts of the cemetery. Sometimes she would appear out of nowhere. Other times, he would see her in the distance, like a silent shadow among the tombstones. The situation reached its peak one night when Carlos decided to confront her directly. He followed the figure to a secluded section of the cemetery, where he stopped in front of a grave. It was an old grave, covered in moss, with an inscription that was barely legible. Carlos felt a chill when he realized that the name on the tombstone matched the description of a woman who had died tragically decades ago. From that moment on, Carlos never saw the woman in white again. However, he could never forget the nights when he was visited by that enigmatic presence. For him, the cemetery stopped being just a place of work and became a place full of mysteries that he would never be able to understand. Among the cemetery's oldest employees, there was a story that everyone knew but rarely mentioned. It was about a particular grave, isolated in a seldom visited area. It was said that anyone who dared to disturb it would face a series of inexplicable misfortunes. The grave belonged to a man named Estevao Rocha, a name that almost no one recognized, but whose inscription on the tombstone sent shivers down the spine. Here lies the one who will never rest. Many believed that Estevao had been accused of witchcraft in the late 19th century, and that his violent death had sealed a curse on his burial site. Julio, a young gravedigger who had just been hired, first heard the story during a lunch with his colleagues. He laughed off the superstitions, calling them stories to scare newbies. But unlike the others, Julio wasn't just curious. He decided to prove it was all a myth. One night, armed with a flashlight and a shovel, he went to Estevao's grave. The trees around him seemed taller and darker than anywhere else in the cemetery, and the air there seemed colder, as if the space itself rejected his presence. As he shoveled the dirt, Julius heard the sound of something like a whisper. He stopped, looking around, but saw no one. "It's just the wind," he told himself, returning to his work. However, the sound continued, now clearer, as if indistinct words were being whispered close to his ear. As he reached the lid of the coffin, Julius felt a chill run through his body. He shone his flashlight into the coffin, and a feeling of regret began to take hold of him. Even so, he decided to open the lid, convinced that there was nothing there but old bones. What he saw, however, was something he could never explain. The inside of the coffin was empty, except for a gold pocket watch that looked new, as if it had been placed there recently. Julio picked up the watch, but the moment his fingers touched it, a wave of panic took hold of him. The flashlight suddenly went out, plunging him into total darkness. The sound of hurried, heavy footsteps echoed around him, but he knew he was alone. Julio screamed, trying to find his way back, but he felt something grab his arm, like icy fingers pulling him back. He managed to free himself and ran as fast as he could to the entrance of the cemetery, abandoning the flashlight and the watch along the way. When he finally reached the gate, he was panting and covered in cold sweat. The next morning, Julio tried to convince himself that it had all been a nightmare. However, his colleagues noticed that he seemed dejected, and he began to avoid talking about what had happened. Days later, he discovered that, since that night, small, inexplicable incidents had started happening to him. Doors would slam shut by themselves, objects would disappear from his house, and he began to hear the same whisper he had heard at Stephen's tomb. Julio's story spread quickly among the employees, reinforcing the legend of the cursed tomb. No one dared to go near the site again, and Estevao Rocha's name once again became taboo in the cemetery. For Julio, the experience was a bitter reminder that certain stories, no matter how absurd they may seem, can carry a terrifying grain of truth. Luana, a history student fascinated by urban legends, began visiting the cemetery to find inspiration for her thesis. Her topic was folk tales associated with ancient cemeteries, and this particular site was full of tales that piqued her curiosity. One afternoon, while walking among the oldest graves, she came across a grave marked with rusty chains around a weathered headstone. The inscription was barely legible, but Luana could make out the words, "Prisoner in life, condemned in death." That immediately caught her attention. Intrigued, she asked the caretaker about the grave. He seemed uncomfortable, hesitating before answering. This grave belongs to a man named Mateus Borges. The story goes that he was a prisoner who escaped and hid here in the cemetery. When he was captured, he was executed, but they say he swore revenge, and since then, strange sounds of chains can be heard at night. Luana, ever the skeptic, decided to investigate. She spent days researching Mateus Borges, but found little reliable information. What she did discover was enough to pique her curiosity. Mateus was known for his brutality, and there were rumors that he practiced dark rituals while in hiding. Determined to find out more, Luana decided to spend a night at the cemetery. She equipped herself with a recorder, a flashlight, and a notebook. She chose a bench near Mateus's grave, from where she could observe everything. The first few hours were peaceful. The silence of the cemetery was almost deafening, interrupted only by the occasional sound of the wind among the trees. Then, around midnight, she heard the first sound, a faint jingling of chains that seemed to come from beneath the earth. Luana swallowed hard, convincing herself that it was just the wind or her imagination. But the sound grew louder and clearer, now accompanied by a metallic noise, as if something were being dragged. With her heart racing, she turned on the recorder and walked toward the grave. "Mateus, if you're here, I just want to understand your story. I didn't come to be disrespectful," she said loudly, her attempt to remain calm evident in her trembling voice. For a moment, everything was silent. But then, a chilling sound broke the stillness. The clang of chains being pulled sharply, followed by a faint whisper that seemed to say, "You shouldn't be here." Luana froze. She felt the ground tremble slightly beneath her feet, and the air around her turned cold. Before she could react, she saw something she would never forget. The chains around the grave began to move on their own, as if they were being pulled by invisible hands. Without a second thought, she ran, leaving behind the recorder and any remaining shred of courage she might have had. When she got home, she tried to process what she had experienced, but she couldn't sleep that night. The next day, she returned to the cemetery to retrieve her recorder, but found it destroyed, as if it had been crushed by an immense force. Since then, Luana swore never to return to the place, but the sounds of the chains continued to haunt her, reappearing in her dreams and even in moments of absolute silence in her home. The night was especially dense in the cemetery, as if an invisible fog hung over the place, muffling even the smallest sounds. Gabriel, the new caretaker, was still not used to working at night, but he did his best to ignore the scary stories his colleagues told. He did not believe in ghosts or curses. To Gabriel, it was all just exaggerations of minds influenced by fear. However, that night something was different. Ever since he had started his rounds, he had felt a growing pressure in his chest, a restlessness he could not explain. As he walked through the oldest part of the cemetery, his flashlight began to flicker. Irritated, he lightly tapped the device, which responded with a flash before going out completely. Gabriel let out a frustrated sigh and picked up his cell phone to use the device's flashlight, but at that moment, he heard a distant sound. It was something similar to footsteps, but not linear. They seemed to drag along, echoing between the graves. Gabriel tried to ignore it, convincing himself that it was just some animal, but the footsteps began to approach, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice firm, but inside he felt a chill run down his spine. Silence was the only answer, followed by a whisper that seemed to come from all sides at once. "You shouldn't be here." Gabriel felt his blood run cold. He turned quickly, illuminating the surroundings with his cell phone, but all he saw were dancing shadows cast by the trees. He decided to quicken his pace, heading towards the central chapel, where he knew he could lock himself away and wait for dawn. On the way, the sound of chains began to echo louder and louder. He looked back and, for a brief second, saw a dark figure among the graves. It was impossible to make out details, but there was something deeply disturbing about its shape. When he finally reached the chapel, He locked the door and tried to catch his breath. The sound of the chains, however, continued, now seeming to surround the small building. Gabriel grabbed the radio to call for help, but the static was so loud that it was impossible to hear anything. Panic began to overwhelm him when the chapel door shook violently, as if something was trying to get in. He screamed, gripping the lock with all his strength, but then the sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Suddenly, the lights inside the chapel flickered, and Gabriel saw something engraved on the opposite wall. Words that seemed to have been scratched into the wooden surface. Last chance to get out. He froze, unable to look away from the message. The room seemed to grow colder and colder, and the feeling that he was not alone became unbearable. When he finally gathered the courage to leave, the sound of faint laughter began to fill the room, echoing in his ears. When he opened the door, he saw the cemetery bathed in a thick fog. He ran as fast as he could to the main gate, without looking back. He felt that if he did, he would see something that his mind would not be able to bear. Gabriel never returned to the cemetery, but the memories of that night haunted him for the rest of his life. He knew he had narrowly escaped, but he also understood that not all of the place's secrets had been revealed. The cemetery continued to hold its stories, waiting for the next curious soul who dared to challenge it. The cemetery, with its time-worn headstones and silent hallways, is much more than a final resting place. For many, it represents a portal between the world of the living and the unknown, a place where stories like these come to life, fueled by generations of curiosity, fear, and mystery. The stories shared tonight are not just chilling tales. They invite us to reflect on what we really know, or don't know, about the boundaries between life and death. Why do some souls seem to find no peace? What force is capable of leaving such profound marks on a place? While some questions remain unanswered, the cemetery remains a space of reverence and respect, but also of mystery and fascination. Each grave, each shadow, each inexplicable sound is a reminder that the world still holds secrets that we may never fully understand. And now, I ask you, which of these stories has left the greatest impression on you? Do you believe these stories are figments of the imagination? Or do you think there is something more sinister lurking in the dark corners of a cemetery? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think about all of this. If you like this video and want to explore more stories like these, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to receive notifications of new content. Your interaction helps a lot and encourages me to bring you more intriguing and chilling stories. And remember, even though the unknown attracts us, it's always good to respect the limits of the invisible. After all, not everything that is hidden wants to be discovered. Until the next video, if you have the courage to come back.